in opposition to many policies in Guyana. He's looking for a greater hope of liberty and freedom, so much so that he started his own political party called Liberty and Justice. He is elected speaker, deputy speaker, forgive me, of the Parliament, the National Assembly in Guyana. And we are excited to have him with us tonight. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we want to introduce to some and present to others the Honorable Lenox Shuman, who is chairman of the Liberty and Justice Party of Guyana. Mr. Shuman, we are honored and thankful for your presence with us this particular evening.
Well, good evening, Ken. I'm really happy to be here. Let me apologize for not at least having the opportunity to be on your program at the earlier proposed date. Time simply got compressed on us. It has been a bit of a hectic year, but I'm very happy to be here, to be able to have some exchanges and share some ideas. Maybe I'll learn a few things also.
Well, I will probably learn a whole lot more from you than you will ever gain from me. But one of the first things that people spoke to me about you is that you are the real deal when it comes to speaking truth to power, unashamedly. And I wanted to ask, in first question, did you believe that you would be elected deputy speaker and a member of the Parliament?
Well, I'm driven by conviction, and I think this goes back to my roots. It is not in conventional terms, nor what I'd say modern day society. I'm an indigenous person from Guyana. I'm a member of the First Nations community. I'm a previous chief and vice chairman of what is known as the National Two-Shows Council. So there is a lot of spiritual guidance that actually brought me to where I am, and that continues to guide me. In modern day, I guess they call it divine intervention here and there. But for us, we've always had our core beliefs rooted and grounded in our ancestors and our lineage. So I've never really strayed far from that. I have always been convinced that I would be getting into Parliament because of how we approached the electoral process, how we approach people, how we approach policies. In terms of being elected the deputy speaker, it has never been an aspiration to get to that point.
Yes.
So getting there in itself, it is a very important marker for Indigenous peoples in Guyana. And I think it is also a very important marker for the country in a whole.
Now, when you say Indigenous people, what people do you represent in terms of in your Indigenous nature? Is it Indian? Is it the Afro-Caribbean? Which exactly group do you represent?
Well, in the U.S. they call it Indians. In Canada they call it the First Nations. In Guyana they used to call it the Amerindians, and then it was switched to the Indigenous peoples. Now it is back to Amerindians again, just recognizing that it is the first peoples of Guyana, the original inhabitants of the land.
Now, as one of the originalists, the country goes back quite a ways. Your people have watched the influx that came from the slave trades. You watched the influx of immigrants from India, and there seems to be a tremendous declination of peace amongst the groups that have come in after the originalists. What is the reason for the discontent from the two groups?
Well, we've also seen a misrepresentation of history. I think history is written by sometimes not necessarily the most literate, but the people who are most willing to do it.
Yes.
If you look at the indigenous people's history in Guyana, take for example the Arakan civilization existed some 3,300 years ago.
Yes.
And that is has been evidenced in the Barbies Mounds, which is on the coast of Guyana. So there is a great injustice that has been done to indigenous peoples in writing the history of the country in itself. The discontent between the other ethnicities in Guyana, it is simply a matter of struggling for power and dominance. We're looking for ethnic and racial dominance in certain cases, which I think drives us a bit too far apart for what should be one of our aspirations is for the Guyanese motto is one people, one nation, one destiny. Now, if you've got two immigrant groups, if I were to put it that way, fighting for ethnic dominance in a land that they pretty much were brought to, then I don't see that you're going to unifying formula. There have been political drives in trying to say, well, we're the only ones that can unite the country. We're the only ones. Well, look at the US. The US is one nation, but yet it is divided by politics. Politics in itself is a big divider. And
Yes.
it is unfortunate that we have to group religion in itself also as a big divider. And I say that not because I want to be insensitive to your viewers, but
Yes.
I have to be realistic with what is represented in many communities. Take, for example, you don't have Catholics mixing with Anglicans, mixing with Pentecostals, mixing with Seventh day Adventists, and all these things, and that is only one denomination. Now, imagine if there was, and imagine if you're to bring seven separate religious groups, and yet you've got so many divisions within one denomination of religion. How do you get unity under that? It becomes an impossible, it becomes a monumental task. I mean, Jesus Christ in himself could not unite a nation. He could not find the world to love him eternally. And thus, Christianity was born. But that in itself, if you were to, let's say, take away the Jesus complex from today's society and you try to say, well, we can unite a nation, who are we to think that we are better than the Son of God? It is an impossible task for us to do that, and it's somewhat arrogant of us to think that we can do that. So, politics in itself, in Guyana, I think when people start to fight to dominate each other, regardless of what context it is, whether it is labor, whether it is politics, religion, just everyday life activities, whether it's law enforcement, however you want to put it, you're never going to find the kind of compassion um, housed in those institutions that could unify a nation. There must be some other drive. I think that one of the things people look at when they look at the US, regardless of how divisive the politics get, the US still is represented on one platform. And that is one thing that we want to drive in Guyana. So it doesn't matter what our political affiliation is, doesn't matter what our religious affiliations are, that we have one drive, and that is to see our country, Guyana, stronger.
Well, and that's one of the great things about the United States in the sense that we are a melting pot. And even if you're Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, Pentecostal, Muslim, Hindu, in the end, because we have the First Amendment for freedom of worship, we can be independent in terms of our worship, but also collectively honor each other's ability to worship. Which leads me to a question regarding Liberty and Justice Party. Are you considered tolerant of all opinions and all expressions of free speech?
Well, we believe that the United Nations was formed for a very specific reason, which is to bring global unity to a certain extent and to bring peace and harmonious existence or coexistence. Now, when you look at the UN Charter about the freedoms that are enshrined in that charter, about the respect for human rights and all those things, it is within that scope that we have established the Liberty and Justice Party. Liberty, you have to be liberated, but within structures. If there's no structure, if there are no structures, then what we have is chaos. So we have to be liberated so that we are tolerant. It is not only about breaking the chains, the physical chains that bind us. It is about liberating your mind so that you're open and accepting of other people's religious identity, as you have said, is represented in the First Amendment of the American Constitution, is also enshrined in the Guyana Constitution, that we have a freedom of worship. We have a right to live in an environment free from discrimination of any sort. That is enshrined in the UN Charter, and all countries, 195 countries, have signed on to that charter, of which Guyana is one of them. When you look at justice, it is one of the greatest failures in society today. Every single country that you could go to, well, I'd say almost every single country, you go that there are people who are being treated unjustly. And in Guyana, it happens on a daily basis. We have enshrined in the Constitution the establishment of a Human Rights Commission, but yet that commission has never convened, it has never been named. And that in itself denies a lot of people their fundamental rights, because they cannot put the human rights context on the injustices that are being done to many people. And there is a group that struggles tremendously from the lack of that commission being convened, and that is the indigenous peoples, or the first peoples of Guyana.
Now, Honorable Lenox Shuman is with us tonight. He is Deputy Speaker in the Parliament in Guyana. He is also chairman of the Liberty and Justice Party, and we are completely honored to have him here tonight. Mr. Shuman, the United Nations has never necessarily been a friend to freedom and liberty, although it serves a sense of human rights. Many individual rights are taken from individuals as a result of an allegiance to the United Nations Human Rights Charter. And there are explicit rights that have the state with greater preference over the individual. Do you not believe that it's important for the Guyanese people, no matter whether they're indigenous or not, to have individual freedom rather than the state having authority over them?
Well, the interesting thing is that the state apparatus develops structures within all of us, within which all of us have to exist and coexist. I don't think at any point the state in itself should be infringing on those fundamental rights and freedoms. Think of it, if the state in itself infringed on the Constitution of the United States of America, what the people would do. So in that sense, I want to believe that the UN, the United Nations, when it was founded, and it was founded by actually a Canadian Prime Minister who led the charge on that, was to ensure that all humanity, within at least as far as he could see at the time, enjoyed the same kind of freedoms, and that there was eternal, or hopefully some hope of eternal peace. But when you look at what the UN has evolved to today, yes, there are infringements where the UN in itself oversteps and overimposes its will, but it's not necessarily the UN oversteps and overimposes its will. If you look at the actions of the people or the nations on the UN Security Council, for example, it is just 5 nations that pretty much want to determine how the rest of the world should live.
Yeah.
Which I think is grossly unfair. You've got what I'd say, the voices of 190 being outweighed by the voices of 5, and now we get into some deeper issues of resources, the distribution of resources, the accumulation of wealth, and I think it pretty much delves into capitalism to a great extent, and how capitalism in itself deprives people, in some cases, I'd say in many cases, of their fundamental rights.
Well, that's amazing. I want to go to capitalism in a moment, but Mr. Shuman, in query to your relationship, Guyana, when I say you, your relationship with the European Union, recently the European Union apologized to Guyana because there was a problem with the conveyance of message in terms of support of the budget for Guyana. The European Union had promised $20 billion, and then 5 days later, that sum turned out to be something like $20 million, and not $200 billion. They stated that they were had a problem with the rate of exchange for Guyana to U.S. dollars to the euro. And so I want to ask you, in the sense that Guyana seemingly is dependent on other nations, are there plans or ideas where your budget isn't supported by the European Union, that is supported solely by the Guyanese people?
Well, absolutely. For the longest while, Guyana was looked at as the poorest country or the second poorest country next to Haiti. And
Yes.
Haiti is a very unique country. You talk of the European Union, of which France is within the European Union. But yet France in itself had to charge the Haitian nation, a tremendous amount of billions of dollars for their freedom. Now, how do you buy freedom? And it has left Haiti in a state where I don't think even the governance structure works.
Yes.
Now, if you were to look at Guyana at one point, we were deemed to be the poorest nation, the second poorest nation in the Caribbean and in the Western world. That is not because we don't have resources. It is not that we are poor in the sense of the word impoverished per se. It is that our resources have never really been managed properly. The governance structure that was meant to look out for the people's interests never really functioned for the people. And I think what we have seen, we've just gone through a long year, the longest election cycle in the history of the earth, 5 months. And it should be in the Guinness Book of World Records. We've actually just gone by that, and it has been a painful lesson for us as a country that is 54 years old. But right now, we have discovered black gold in Guyana off the shores, oil. We are supposed to be the richest nation per capita on this planet. We have gold, we have bauxite, lumber, rice, sugar, diamonds, rare earth metals, and now we have oil. The one thing that we have never had in Guyana, the one key that we have never had in Guyana is good governance. And it is because of that reason that Guyana has continuously existed on the margins of poverty. And when we talk about the UN and all of these loan tools and all, grants,
Yes.
at some point in the very near future, we will see Guyana not dependent on any single nation for revenues. We will be in a position where our economy becomes self-generating. Of course, what we still need in Guyana is good governance. And we intend on pressing this administration, the PPP's administration, to ensure that they do deliver good governance for the people of Guyana.
Well, it's seemingly, in terms of good governance, a for the people, by the people in the United States of America, and we are energy independent. We are the most powerful military, the most prosperous nation on the face of the earth. Yet it's not the state that guarantees the individual, it's the individual that guarantees the state. And it seems that that's a vice versa condition in Guyana, where under capitalism here in the United States, where U.S. citizens own 80% of the country and manage all of the productivity of the industries, it seems in Guyana 80% of the industries are owned by the state, 20% by the individuals. And for 54 years, you've been practicing communism, first under Soviet rule, and then now under Chinese investment. It doesn't seem that communism is working at all, and that will be the most debilitating thing to Guyana actually taking advantage of all of its resources. What say you to that?
Well, there is a very interesting thing because we talk about capitalism as though it is the holy grail of governance models. I mean, if you look at the US, there are cities where people have lived in poverty for all their lives and they perpetually have family members who live in poverty. So capitalism in itself is not the answer. Obviously, communism is not the answer. What needs to happen is a happy marriage between what I'd say a variety of governance structure. there needs to be some degree of socialism, and there needs to be some degree of capitalism. When you've got a country that drives capitalism, what you have are the super rich getting richer and the poor getting even poorer. There must be some state of equilibrium in any country where the country can continuously sustain itself, where people are not dependent on the state. They get to a point of interdependence between their neighbors, their families, and the state. I think ultimately interdependence is what everyone is chasing. If you take, a lot of people talk about communist China. It is a communist country with a capitalist economy. And I think if you look at a lot of Chinese folks, they have a lot of super wealthy Chinese folks. So I don't know that that in itself is also the model. When you
Well,
talk about the ownership of resources and industries in Guyana, that is something that was driven through a PNC, or People's National Congress, led by then President Barnum, to nationalize every single industry because he wanted the state to control every iota of the country. And what happened when he left office? Um, President Desmond Hoyt, who in my view is one of the greatest presidents in the country, because he brought democracy back to the country, and he started to, what I'd say, divest the state's interests in these industries. He pretty much permitted the economy to flourish. He permitted the private sector to emerge. Granted, he may not have had the economic wherewithal to get it all done, but that is his legacy. And what we are seeing right now is a transformation or a transition from what I call this communist idealism into somewhat of a hybrid between communism and capitalism.
well, see, one of the problems with hybrids, while the engine you cannot hear, it is also muzzled in terms of its potential. You see, under a free minded, liberty oriented people, this nation, the most powerful and most prosperous independent energy nation in the world, has its ownership by the people and for the people. In addition to that, it is the government which receives revenue from us, and that government, out of our prosperity, is able to pay poor people in this country upwards of $40,000 a year to remain poor. When you take a look at Guyana, the average poor person in Guyana is making 6,000 US dollars per year. If you had greater freedom and greater liberty and opened yourselves to a capitalist nation where the people owned the products, the people owned the industries, they would create a greater sense of revenue to support the poor of and by themselves. And in addition to that, be able to maintain a strong economy and a strong nation. When I ask you in terms of the military question, you will have the second largest resource of oil in the world, only behind the United States. But your military is lacking. Do you not consider yourself a national security threat to not only the U.S., but to other nations around you?
Well, it's you've opened a few doors there. Let's
Thank you.
address the market. Let's address the market side for us.
Okay.
I don't disagree that people should be given the opportunity to generate wealth for themselves. I don't disagree with that notion at all. All I'm saying is that there must be some happy margin between what a person can do, and there must be some limiting factor so that we don't end up having people becoming trillionaires with money that they can't spend, and we have people who are begging in the streets. There must be some balance in there. There must be some state of equilibrium. And I quite agree that the people need to own the industry. That is why I say we're in a transformative and transitional state. And we are not there yet, but we are going to get there. In terms of the national security issue, basically the zone within which Guyana falls, if you look at the recent conflicts, what I'd say nation to nation conflict in the Western Hemisphere, I don't think that you could name one Within the last 50 years, short of the US going into some of these places like the invasion of Grenada, maybe Ecuador, and correction, El Salvador, and a few other places. But outside of that, there has not been a nation to nation conflict. So the zone of peace still exists within the Western Hemisphere. And I don't anticipate that Guyana, or I don't see that Guyana becomes a national security threat to anyone. Militarily, of course, we are a small country of 750,000 people. For a country of 750,000 people, what military might do we really need? I think for the larger geopolitical forces, we leave that to the US, to Russia, and China to play that out. We try not to get involved in that. What we want to do is to ensure that the people of Guyana benefit from the resources and benefit from good governance, and
Well,
that everyone is permitted the opportunity and the latitude to ascend as far as they possibly can, both individually and nationalistically.
do you feel, and I got to ask you a constitution question right after this, but do you feel that, and I really, I really believe and trust your willfulness in terms of prosperity for your people, but China is hammering down on Guyana, and Russia has always been there, and now Iran is stepping in there, and they're all interested in not only the oil that you have, but the resources that you have, and also a place in which they can establish ports and other things which are in direct uh, geography to the United States of America, which by your statement is supposed to keep the peace for Latin America. Uh, isn't that a bit winsome in terms of a belief, though, when you know that these institutions, like China, which is taking ports away from African nations because they can't pay back the Belt and Road Initiative dollars that they've taken, don't you believe that's a little naive in terms of expecting the U.S. to completely control the peace while you open yourselves up to the threats of the world?
Well, we don't intend on relinquishing our peace to anyone. I think that is for the government of Guyana and the Guyanese people to determine what direction they want to go. But what I will say is that there has been some pushback against, foreign influence in our national policy. When I've said this before, and I will say it again, we want to ensure that the people of Guyana benefit from the resources. About a
Yes.
month and a half ago, we had some investors from the US who showed up there and said they're willing to invest up to $200 billion in the country. We have also not permitted China the ability and the authority to come into the country carte blanche. The Russians have always been there. We've always had diplomatic ties with many of these countries, and we don't see that they have gotten a foothold in the Guyana. We haven't seen anyone really gotten a foothold in Guyana, and we are happy with it that way. What we would like to see are a lot more partnerships with a lot more nations that will ensure that we continue to be this moderator, that we continue to stimulate conversations around peace. It is the only way that we could we could look at global coexistence.
Well, global coexistence works well not only with peace but also with might. I just want to advise you of that. You're going to need both someday. Now, in final, your Constitution, and I hope that you'll come back on our program because I really enjoyed our conversation. But Mr. Shuman, your Constitution, according to your state, was to be reviewed some 30 some odd years ago, and corrections made to it. There have been complaints by the people of Guyana that the Constitution has yet to be reviewed, that is a committee that hasn't even taken first steps. The Constitution in two places assures the happiness of the Guyanese people, but it doesn't give rights to the individual in that particular sense. When will Guyana review its constitution? Will it always remain a cooperative state, thus taking the state above the individual? And then lastly, do you believe that your state can survive with a continued power centered in the country's elite few and not in the hands of many?
Well, let's start off with the first question, the constitutional question.
Yes.
The Constitution is the way it is because there has been no political will to have it revised. Both political parties, when they're out of office, talk nice about constitutional reform, but when they get in there, they enjoy the powers conferred upon them within the Constitution. We have an executive president that enjoys that power. And basically, when they have power in their hands, why would they want to cede that to anyone? Why would they want to cede it to the people? The president is treated pretty much like the king in Guyana. Very little that they can do and get charged or, anything of the sort. But that being said, the Liberty and Justice Party, along with some other newer parties, we are knocking at that door. We are at the doorstep, and we intend on holding the government to account to ensure that the Constitution is revised. Now, the political question comes into play. In order to revise the Constitution, you need 66% of the House to revise it. When the People's Progressive Party, Civic, is in office, and they would chair the Constitutional Revision Committee, when they table a motion, or they may set some ridiculous hours for the committee to sit, whereby the opposition would not show up. Mm-hmm. And if they propose to revise the Constitution, then the opposition would be left to shame, and they'll lose electoral ground in the next election. And likewise, if the opposition proposes constitutional reform, then the government stands to lose electoral grounds in the next election. So there's this bit of playing chicken with the Constitution. What we intend on doing is figuring out how we could break that deadlock between the two parties and ensure constitutional reform becomes a reality. When we get to that point, then we would be able to address the cooperatives, we'd be able to address a variety of articles, inclusive, hopefully, of the executive presidency. I can't remember your second question, sorry.
Yeah, well, no worries. We're going to have you come back and we'll talk about those second questions. But in follow up to that statement there, the problem with the chicken and the egg regarding a communist constitution is that no power is ever ceded enough to change it, which means the people will never be free enough by the will of the state to have power in the land. So when you come back on my program, hopefully in the year, I want to talk with you about the sense that there are people from Berbice to Georgetown who feel that this government doesn't speak to them. And in fact, on the first show that we did regarding the Constitution, 46% of the people that watched that show were open to a constitution that was very similar to the United States of America, if not becoming a part of the United States of America. So I think you all need to take a little time.
Can I interrupt?
Yes, go right ahead.
Let me interrupt you a bit. I don't think that a lot of your viewers and a lot of people in the U.S. understand the origins of the Constitution of the United States of America. There's a little reserve just north of Toronto called the Six Nations Reserve. Mm-hmm. And when the founders and the drafters of the Constitution of the United States visited there, they saw how the people were living, and believe it or not, the American Constitution is modeled after the Six Nations grouping just north of Toronto here. Now, I don't see that there's a perfect constitution. I think to a great extent, when the Canadians were looking at devising their constitution, they foresaw that there would be great difficulties in the American Constitution, and I think some of those things are being played out right now. Pardon me, my daughter said.
Oh no, that's right. Beautiful young lady.
Yeah. So one of the things, right? There is great difficulty, and if you think of what Donald Trump is trying to do right now, trying to use his executive authority to overturn the elections, to set aside the people's franchise and all these things. And we have to look at the U.S. The U.S., is being touted as the defenders of democracy globally, or the pushers of democracy. They've got this very strong institutional framework that addresses all these things. But yet here you have the same issues that were attempted in Guyana over the 5 months being pushed in the US. Now, it would be interesting to see how that gets addressed come January.
Well,
So we have to be careful. There isn't a very unique model that I think that we could point to that would represent Guyana. We also have to understand that Guyana is a vastly different state from the U.S.
almost certainly.
We have our own unique difficulties geographically, ethnically, a whole host of things. So, pardon me, I've got a
She's
little.
gorgeous.
Hi, this again.
Listen,
Yeah.
but Mr.
So we've
Shuman,
got a lot of things wrapped up in there.
yes, Mr. Shuman, but I must refute what you're saying there. We've had at least 3 elections in the U.S. that were fraudulent. Thomas Jefferson was the first to be elected under our Constitution, where the state legislatures were directly involved. Rutherford B. Hayes was the last in 1876 to be involved. So this is not a unique thing to us under our Constitution. And in fact, our Constitution mandates that the state legislature, not the popular vote, elects our president. So it seems like our founding fathers have kind of thought ahead on this particular thing. Donald Trump is not trying to use any executive order to take away the will of the people. He's applying the Constitution as every other president has been allowed to. Listen, it's tremendous talking with you, Mr. Shuman, and I look forward to talking with you in the new year. Merry Christmas to you and your baby.
Thank you so much. Likewise, I look forward to this discussion continuing.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me
Christmas.
on your show, and do have a fantastic Christmas and a New Year.
You too. Thank you so much.
Bye.
We are honored this particular evening to have had the Honorable Lenox Shuman, and you can tell he's a family man, a man who loves his children, and that's absolutely beautiful. No matter where you are in the world, there's something about the individual and family that supersedes everything else. When we come back from the break, ladies and gentlemen, we will be talking with no one better than Onik Prasad regarding my conversation with the parliamentary member, and also hopes of ending communism in Guyana. You are watching the Exceptional Conservative Show live from the nation's capital. We'll be right back with more of the best in Urban Conservative Talk right after this.